This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. I'm in Seattle today for the podcast, in person, in real life. CDC guidelines are out, and vaccinated people can hang out without masks, and it just feels like a beautiful, beautiful time. And so, yeah, I got on a plane and headed up to the Pacific Northwest to go talk to some brewers that I wanted to talk to. And one of the people that I was insistent on talking to is Steve Luke from Cloudburst Brewing. Welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Thanks for swinging on by.
You know, we wrote a breakout brewer story on Cloudburst back in 2017. Emily Hutto wrote it. And we actually have a recipe for a Cloudburst beer, I believe, in the magazine too. And so, all of that is there for subscribers of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They should go back and check all of those stories out. We're going to talk about brewing hazy beers. We're going to talk about brewing West Coast IPAs, hoppy beers. You know, we're going to dive into all of that and more. But first, as the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, reliability, and dedication to their customers' craft. New this year, redundancy meets efficiency. G&D's micro-channel condensers are built with all aluminum construction, which eliminates galvanic corrosion. Using half the refrigerant of conventional condensers with fewer brazed connections translates to a lower GWP and less opportunity for leaks. Call G&D Chillers today to discuss your project or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, this episode is brought to you by Crisp Scottish Pale Ale Malt. Crisp Scottish Pale Ale Malt is the workhorse of many a brewery and is at home in a variety of beer styles. Crisp sources the lowest nitrogen spring barley from farmers in Fife up to Moray. During malting, high cast moistures and a balance of optimal germination time and temperature results in an even, well-modified malt with a rich color and balanced sweet malt flavor, which is ideally suited to ale brewing. Visit bsgcraftbrewing.com for more information on Crisp Scottish Pale Ale Malt or call 1-800-374-2739. So, Steve.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, before this, can I plug G&D too? Because we have two of their chillers and they're fantastic.
You are welcome to plug them.
So I just want to say that. Hey, hi, G&D.
They're good folks. They've been supporting our podcast for years, and we appreciate their support. And it's great to have a sponsor that every brewer I talk to has had wonderful experience with and respects. So there you go. Yeah.
Add us to the list.
Very cool. So, Steve, talk to me about Cloudburst. Give us the historical background on you brewing. What got you here, what led up to the creation of Cloudburst, and then we can talk about the beers that you focus on.
Totally, yeah. Man, what got me here? I guess we can start back to my undergrad days. I went to a little school in central Maine called Colby College, where there's really not a lot to do, but drink, craft beer.
Right.
And so one of my first memories at school there, you have this like orientation where a senior kind of has a group of freshmen and they kind of like get you acclimated to the campus. And he gave our group this hot tip that there was this small brewery in the woods 20 miles from campus, where they didn't really care how old you were.
Yeah.
And so
the usual reason people choose craft beer,
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. So we were like, let's, one of these days, like, let's go check out this brewery. I believe the brewery still exists, but we did drive up to someone's house. There was a barn, maybe like 50 feet offset of the property,
right.
Knocked on the front door of the house. And it was an 80-ish-year-old man named Skip who answered the door. And we said, hi, we're here to buy some growlers. And he said, oh, great. I'll meet you on over at the barn. He hopped on a trailer, rode that trailer for like 5 minutes because it was an easy walk. We kind of walked aside the trailer to that barn. He opened up the barn door, and there was a 7-barrel pub system in there with 4 7-barrel tanks or so. Asked if we were all 18 years old. I think the reason why they didn't care how old you were was because he thought that was still the legal drinking age. And
it should be.
It should be. Vermont supposedly is moving towards that direction, or they were. So yeah, we tried his beers. I knew nothing about beer. They tasted very bitter. Kind of just like these amber ales that I think everyone was kind of making.
Right.
That never really had much to them, but they were affordable. It was a fun experience, and that was kind of like my first inkling of like what the craft brewing industry was. After a few years in Maine, I spent a summer in Portland, found myself drinking a lot of Allagash White.
Sure.
Decided that since I was spending all of my disposable income on Allagash White, maybe I should pop in and see if they're looking for part-time help.
Right.
They needed help sweeping the floors and kind of building boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, great, sign me up. And spent a summer working there. That was back in 2005. It was, I think Allagash maybe had like 8 or 9 employees. Fell in love with that entire team there. And that was kind of the first aha moment that maybe I could like find a job after college in this type of industry.
Yeah.
And yeah, so kind of having such a first positive summer experience working for them, finished up school, found a job washing kegs at a brewery in Pleasantville, New York, named Captain Lawrence Brewing.
Captain Lawrence, sure.
So employee number 2 at Captain Lawrence.
Really?
Yes.
I was probably in that brewery at some point in that 2000 stretch. I lived in New York City, and we'd go mountain biking up at Graham Hills in Pleasantville.
Yes.
Yeah. And when we would do that, or Blue Mountain up at in Peekskill, and when we would do that, I would pop into the Captain Lawrence, tasting room, and just buy some growlers, get some tasters.
Totally.
After a ride.
Yeah. Scott was awesome. Kind of watching him start up his own operation.
Yeah.
All the while, living in my parents' basement in Connecticut, looking for, a quote unquote real job in the craft brewing industry, which was kind of more of the marketing sales side of things.
Yeah.
Landed a job at Harpoon Brewing in Boston a few months after that in their marketing department, kind of like the lowest level position, which was their visitor center manager.
Right.
Giving tours, talking about beer.
Sure.
That was fun for like a year, but realized I really wanted to be on the other side.
Yeah.
So called Jason Perkins at Allagash back up and said, do you have anything in production for me? And he said, sure. Yeah, we'll find something for you. Moved back to Maine, and over the course of almost 2 years, went from keg washing and bottling to the cellar and up onto the brew house. So really learned to brew by making Allagash White, 7 times out of 8 shifts.
But what a great place to learn how to brew, though.
Yeah, it was awesome. They're such great people.
For sure.
A lot of what we do at Cloudburst they've certainly made an impact on kind of the way that we do things. So after brewing there, I was still dating my college girlfriend, now my wife. She was in dental school at UConn. May or may not have gotten the ultimatum of, hey, you're in Maine, I'm in Connecticut.
Right.
We should probably live together. So moved down to Connecticut, found not a lot of brewing jobs in Connecticut in like 2007.
Right.
I know their scene now it's
popping.
Fantastic. Man, there's talking about IPAs later on. I had a great IPA from Counterweight Brewing Company. It's a cool scene to see how it develops. But back then, not a lot going on. Living outside Hartford, found a job at Thomas Hooker Brewing Company. I guess before that, I had 4 days at Opa Opa Brewing Company. that was, with all the jobs that I've had, that was a bridge that I burnt. I don't, you don't light every bridge on fire. You hope to not do it at all. But, I definitely left on not great terms at Opa Opa Brewing Company. But,
it worked out in the long run.
Yeah. So Thomas Hooker Brewing Company, while I was brewing there, Cambridge House Brew Pub, a small pub in Granby, Connecticut, had an opening for a head brewer. I kind of had nothing to lose, and took that job while still doing like night shift brewing at Thomas Hooker. Cambridge House Brewing Company opened up a second location, another 7-barrel pub. Was working at 3 spots for a time. Not much fun.
Hustling,
totally.
grinding.
Yeah. And learning a lot. I mean, I think anytime you have the first title of head brewer, the pressure is there. And even telling people that, I've worked with in the past where they've kind of got that opportunity, the best places to become a head brewer are places that might not be known. And you might not necessarily, like, their reputation might be okay as far as beer quality goes, but that only leaves more room for you to come in and learn and improve and take risks, because you don't necessarily, you don't have a reputation as a brewer, at this point, kind of a thing. So left Thomas Hooker, stayed on at Cambridge House Brew Pubs. Cambridge House Brew Pubs later closed for tax evasion. Which I should have known because I was getting paid in cash, at one spot. We were long on hop contracts at the other spot. It all worked out, though, because I had gotten accepted to the UC Davis Master Brewers program in 2010. So my wife finished getting her DMD. I went out to UC Davis for 6 months, and she matched for a residency program at the VA hospital in Seattle. So Seattle we moved to in 2010. The only place that would hire me for like a head brewing job at the time was Rogue's outpost at the Issaquah Brew House.
Yeah.
So took over that 15-barrel system for about a year, then was offered the job as a lead brewer at Elysian by my former boss, Dick Cantwell, who was buzzed at a beer festival. tried my beer, said, "Oh, this is great," and I said, "Oh, well, I emailed you like 3 times with my resume for any position, and you never responded." And he said, "I might have a job for you, I suppose." And so turned around, it was turned around, put in my notice, and was at Elysian for 5 years as their lead brewer at the Fields location. Mm-hmm. Then the infamous sale to AB InBev happened. I was fortunate enough that I had already had a business plan in the works, but that certainly expedited my departure from Elysian and starting Cloudburst at the end of 2015.
So you decide to go out and do your own thing, and you have this plan to do it. I want to talk to you a little bit more about the kind of how you developed a vision for what Cloudburst is going to be, what you're going to brew, all of that kind of thing. But first, a brewery might have 99 problems, but your fruit supplier shouldn't be one. Old Orchard is already known for their quality concentrates, but they also pride themselves on consistent product and reliable supply. When brewers need assistance, Old Orchard is just an email, phone call, or even a text away. Based in Greater Grand Rapids, Michigan, better known as Beer City, USA, Old Orchard is core to the brewing community. To join their fruit family, learn more at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, for years, Brewery DB has been the industry's only professionally curated source of brewery and beer information. In 2019, over 1 million brewery visits were made by craft fans searching for breweries on brewerydb.com. In just a few weeks, Brewery DB will unveil an all-new experience to help craft lovers get back on the brewery trail. To take full advantage of the enhanced marketing power of Brewery DB and increase your taproom traffic, set up your account on marketmybrewery.com. That's marketmybrewery.com. It's easy and it's free. So you have this idea to launch your own brewery, and now you've got the impetus to do it because that scenario was changing at Elysian. How'd you come up with an idea for Cloudburst, and how'd you know what you're gonna brew?
Well, I mean, I think at Elysian Fields, coming up with new recipes every week. It's kind of similar still to what we do to this day. So I think, prior to that buyout, I had the best brewing job in a city with so many breweries because I had, a long leash to make whatever beer I wanted to while not worrying about the costs of anything.
Right.
And so I kind of thinking along those lines with Cloudburst, even my business plan at the time, you have that typical old brewery business model of like, here are my flagships, here are my seasonals, here are my special releases.
Right.
But around that time, there weren't a lot of breweries that were not doing that type of model. They were all kind of almost designed for what like distributors and large box stores like wanted. That's kind of how they still almost think in SKUs.
Sure, SKUs, right.
And I knew that I didn't really want to fit into that mold because of how good I had it at Fields. I think I love brewing flagship beers. I mean, brewing Allagash White almost every day. There is beauty in trying to nail the consistency to a T every single day. And it's really hard to be a great production brewer. But it's also not the most creative. It might not be the most rewarding for someone who just spent 5 years kind of making whatever they wanted to make, and following one's whim. So Cloudburst kind of was born out of what if we do a production brewery where we have no set recipe, no set kind of vision as far as what beers will be out in the market, only that we as a brewery can kind of like have like a larger umbrella of we're going to be hop forward. We're going to try to do, highlight hops. We like dark beers. Let's do some dark beers. There's still really no lager brewery operating out of Seattle. So maybe we can kind of go over there. It was kind of like, how do we focus on a larger swath of beers versus like, let's just like make these same beers over and over again.
Yeah. How do you, launching a new business, how did you expect to connect with consumers and, and make that? Because, the reason for these kinds of core brands and beers over and over again is, people latch onto them and they want to keep drinking them. How'd you set out to get people to buy your beer again?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of,
or even for the first time, for that matter.
Totally. We at least Seattle is such a local centric city. They've always put emphasis on small independent businesses that are a little bit more transparent, more genuine. And so when I left Elysian with 6 ex-Elysian employees to open up Cloudburst, it was
There's a little story around that.
Yeah, it was a little easy to say, stop drinking the corporate beer when we're going to give you a new option.
That story writes itself. Yeah.
So that part, between that and kind of, some of the beers that I developed at Fields went on to be, big hits for Elysian. And so I at least had enough of a reputation that this person should be able to recreate some of my favorite IPA recipes or similar types along those lines. And then it kind of happened at the same time with like the craft beer growing enough that so many drinkers out here, the most common question where you go into a bar or a bottle shop is, well, what's new? What haven't I tried yet? And that's even gotten wilder and wilder to this day. You look at Untapped and everyone just kind of wants to tick and check in anything that they haven't had.
Right.
And so kind of offering an IPA every week that was usually a different recipe for sure, but Cloudburst IPAs kind of all do have some similarities to them. Like we certainly structure them to our personal preferences. I know that's almost cliche these days to say we brew the beer that we like to drink and then we sell the rest. And but that was the direction we were going in. It was just like, let's offer a new IPA almost every week so that when people come into here or a bar or a bottle shop and they ask, hey, what's new? Oh, this Cloudburst has a new IPA out, so you should try that.
Yeah. Let's talk about how you make those IPAs, because clearly, you've won plenty of awards with those IPAs, and in addition to that, have garnered the respect of peers for the quality of those hoppy beers that you make. And when I say hoppy beers, I don't just mean hazy IPAs. We're talking about West Coast IPAs, anything with hops and Pilsner as well. You guys play in those kinds of fields, and that does seem to be the thing that people know Cloudburst for. How do you when you are thinking about an IPA, where does that creative process start?
Oh, I mean, when thinking about IPA, I think a lot of the word that we kind of always throw out first is balance.
No, we don't.
Right?
The B word.
I know. Do people say that all the time now?
I just love it because everyone says balance. I'm like, well, what do you mean by balance? Because balance means something different to every person.
That's true.
Just like the word complex,
Sure.
like you use the word, but what does it mean?
That was my second word I was going to just say. No. All right. And then we're talking to brewers too. So balance to me is I guess four parts as far as having a strongly hopped flavor throughout the beer and aroma, while balancing bitterness, and making sure that, here's another cliche word, but making sure the overall beer is drinkable.
Yeah.
And so to me that means finishing quite dry.
Yeah.
Our yeast typically attenuates our IPAs between 2.2 Plato to like 1.8 Plato, which is quite dry for
right.
most hoppy beers, because you almost fear that if it's too dry, that balance kind of is not harmonious anymore with bitterness. It's going to taste too bitter or too harsh. And so really kind of we're just trying to make this hop forward beer that is full of flavor, yet finishes dry and crisp enough that you want to drink more of it, is kind of the overarching philosophy.
Right.
So, using really neutral malts, using our house yeast. I think we might still be one of the only hop forward breweries that quote unquote has like this house yeast that we use on every ale.
Yeah.
We're not playing the game of this IPA is going to be hazy, so let's bring in some London 3, or this is a West Coast IPA, let's bring in some Chico.
What's that house yeast?
House yeast is it's called corporate ale yeast. It's A30.
Corporate ale yeast.
So
Okay.
so we got to name it. So it's actually Elysian's house yeast.
Oh, okay.
And so when AB purchased Elysian, they stopped ordering yeast from Siebel, and that yeast is now banked at Anheuser-Busch. The Siebel strain that we were using at Elysian was BRY 96. So another one of those, a little like cloudy histories, but they say it comes from New York somewhere, upstate New York. This, ale yeast that is kind of American and kind of English. It's low ester. It flocks well. It's highly attenuative. And so we couldn't access that anymore, because I think there were only a few breweries going through, Siebel to kind of get that yeast. One was La Cumbra. I don't know if they still use it. But they kind of just stopped offering it. So we had to kind of beg and plead for a slant to be sent to a brewery in Portland that we've never met anyone there from, so that the Imperial yeast people could then kind of pick it up, clean it up, and prop it up. And we got to name it, since it was a new strain to their bank, and we made it publicly available because it certainly should be.
Yeah.
And so that's the yeast we use, this corporate ale yeast.
Oh, I love the dig. That's classic.
Yes.
So you've described, the general behavior. That is the same yeast you use it for both hazy or cloudy beers and for kind of cleaner West Coast style or American style IPAs.
Yeah. So it's one of those yeasts. So both Zach was brewing at Elysian, our other brewer, and myself. So kind of the impetus was this is a yeast that we are incredibly familiar with. We ferment it slightly cooler. It's a pretty long primary fermentation, and really kind of just focusing on almost minimal flavor impact from that yeast. There are some pretty like stone fruit esters from it, and you can certainly see that the warmer you ferment it, you probably wouldn't recognize our beer. And so, yeah, we kind of derive our haze when we're doing something hazy from either our grain, but also our mill settings. A lot of it's hot polyphenols, and then I know you kind of walked around a little bit, but the shape of our fermenters really unitanks. We don't have any conditioning tanks. They're squat and have quite a large diameter. And I think a little bit of that has some effect on kind of creating some of this haze.
I just assumed it's because you have short ceilings in here and wanted to kind of maximize that kind of thing, but
it was not by design,
right?
But
we're in this kind of bunker, old building with So with that kind of so what you're saying is that if those were taller tanks, then you're going to potentially end up with higher pressure, especially lower down in that tank, that might cause more of that to precipitate out.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we've seen it at least with we have a couple of tall, skinny tanks, and we certainly see more. Those beers brighten up faster for sure. Whatever kind of voodoo is going on, whether it's hydrostatic pressure or something that we inadvertently don't actually know what we're doing. I don't know if that's okay to admit, but. But yes, to me,
this is where the magic happens.
There's only so much you can control.
Do you take some steps, on those hazy IPAs to kind of solidify that? I mean, obviously you're going to use some ingredients in the grist to kind of foster that too. Are there methods that you use in order to kind of solidify that and keep it from falling out? Because people buy a hazy IPA, they want it to be hazy.
Totally. I mean, we have, a few IPAs that we can show you that have a beautiful haze, stable haze to them are still just, raw 2-row and Wireman Pills base.
Yeah.
Our mill gap setting is pretty tight. And so some of that haze we can attribute to kind of having just a tighter mill setting. One of those things that you don't really think about, you kind of go straight to the wheats and the oats and spelt and some other type of higher protein adjuncts to kind of create that haze, which we do as well. But sometimes it's just a matter of having a really awesome, mash ladder ton and being able to kind of tighten that mill gap a little bit more.
Yeah. With that grist, you do keep it generally pretty simple.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of our philosophy is keep it simple, stupid.
Sure.
As far as when we're designing a beer, a lot of it kind of comes from there's kind of two ways we approach designing like a new IPA. And one is what's the overall flavor profile that we want, out of this beer. And I think kind of just coming up with an end game thought really helps you kind of then focus and streamline on how you're going to build that beer together. Conversely, the other thing is do we want to build a beer around a specific hop variety or a specific combination of hop varieties? And that's kind of the two starting points of here's our blank recipe. What do we want to do? But as far as our malt bills go, I think kind of along the lines with a lot of people, we certainly use raw churro as our base malt and Wireman Pills is kind of our secondary base malt. We feather in, white wheat, red wheat. We are transitioning from anything flaked over to malted. So instead of using flaked oats or flaked barley, flaked rye, we'd prefer to use an oat malt or a rye malt.
Why is that?
That is kind of coming down to some newer topics of beer soluble iron in the gelatinization process. Really something that I didn't care about until a year ago or so, where You get a canning line, you have your Anton Par, you're really focused on, chasing DO the entire time. And so you can kind of get into this, DO world that our specs, for a hoppy beer with some haze, some more turbidity. We do see higher DOs that on beers that have a higher turbidity to them. I don't know why, because I'm not a packaging brewer. Although now I am.
Because you were putting it all into draft and
Totally.
into kegs before the pandemic, sure.
But so like our unshaken DOs for hoppy beers, we're hoping for mid 30s, and our shaken DOs are hoping for mid 40s ppb. Well, we started kind of like looking at shelf life. Obviously, you're going to kind of build this library to then assess the quality of your beer, your packaged beer, going forward. Even though most of our hop forward beers are kind of don't exist after 3 or 4 weeks or so,
right,
by our model. And we started finding that beers that had higher flaked content seemed to not necessarily have like an oxidative character you'd associate with like poor packaging, but it almost was kind of this like more of this mid palate flavor we were kind of picking up on. And then around that same time we had sent some beers to Chris Swersey, who
sure, competition director for the Brews Association. Yeah.
I'd sent him a pale ale with a hop research council experimental variety. Chris is also involved with the HRC. We fell into these hops, so whenever we kind of fall into these experimental varieties, we like to send beer out to. We're not involved with the HRC, but people in the HRC should taste these beers we just made with their hops.
Right.
So I sent him out some of those pale ales along with a smoked porter and some other little beers, and he started talking about the smoked porter and which specialty malts did you use, and kind of got along the lines as far as like, here's something that we're kind of starting to look at from a quality standpoint is beer soluble iron, and kind of what that means and what that does.
Yes, this is the first time I'm hearing this term, and I'm really curious. What is beer soluble iron?
So it's iron that's iron that is absorbed into the grain that is usually involved during that grain coming in contact with not stainless steel, so mild steel. And so that plus a heat source, so crystal malts, roasted malts, gelatinized grains. If that type of equipment isn't stainless steel, you're going to technically have a higher iron content on that grain. That grain that you're brewing with, then at some point, some of that is going to exist in your beer, and it's going to oxidize, quicker.
Right.
Much like, if you were brewing with a tainted water source. I think a tainted water source is much easier to say this, I shouldn't brew with this, or like what's going on. But as far as like the grain goes, especially for, us, like such a tiny packaging brewery, there's what we have found is there's endless wormholes once you start packaging to kind of go down.
Sure.
But so one of those wormholes in this whole tangent is just, what is that? I don't know, but we don't have the time or resources or a lab or a department to really do anything other than the fact that we can say, maybe just for the sake of, what little we do know, we don't have to use certain types of, ingredients per se.
Right.
And so that's kind of where we went down that wormhole and why we're kind of moving over to malted oats instead of flaked oats. So now,
because through that malting process, it's only coming into contact with stainless steel. Those big malting drums are.
It depends on the supplier. Not everyone has, this is why why Chris didn't really want to. I don't think Chris even really wants to be talking about this right now. So whatever you edit, it is fine. But suppliers are cagey about this.
Sure.
They don't want, when you start asking a maltster, what is your kiln made of? Then their first question is, well, why?
Right.
And I don't think they're, I don't know if there's really organizations, I don't know if like AMBA or anyone has some type of, you know, like trade relationship with maltsters. Like we were just talking about the Hop Research Council
Right.
or the Hop Quality Group, which I'm a part of, you know, where we do, you know, field visits and not necessarily audits, but, you know, we are welcomed onto a property of a farm just to kind of see their operations. And then we kind of give recommendations, you know, for improvements if anything is needed.
Sure.
And that took, you know, I know it took Hop Quality Group a decade, you know, work of Tom Nielsen and Mallet and Vinny to be like, we're not like cops. We're here to kind of just see, hey, your hops really are important to the beers that we make. The more consistent and higher quality the hops that you're coming, you know, from the field through your facility, like the better our beer is going to be and the more beer we're going to sell and the more hops we're going to buy. I don't know if that exists on the malt side of things.
Right.
And so I know it's a sensitive subject as far as like who's using, you know, whose equipment is what.
Sure.
And it's not always an indicator of quality too. I mean, you can go into some of the best breweries in this country and they're brewing this beer on a piece of equipment that looks like it should be in the scrapyard.
Right.
And they still make phenomenal beer. So
there are elements of this brewery that we're sitting in right now. Not the brew house and not any of the fermentation cellar, but yeah, there's some spots that look kind of, you know, duct taped together.
Oh,
here,
totally. Yeah. Our hot liquor tank came out of a dairy farm in Wisconsin, out of a field, and the stainless steel on the inside was great. Yeah. And a few years back when Sierra Nevada was doing their beer camp series, Ken Grossman came through, and, you know, one of the sayings at UC Davis, you know, when one professor would always say, treat your brewery like Ken Grossman is going to like walk through it at any moment.
Yes.
And so you're like, oh my God, this moment's actually happening. We need to clean up everything. Everything needs to be spotless, you know, big, deep clean. He's walking through the brewery because I'm sure he's seen thousands of breweries at this point. And he comes to the hot liquor tank and he says, this is my favorite thing I've seen on this trip. It reminds me so much of all the equipment that I used.
Right.
In the 80s, and you're like, oh, I shouldn't be self-conscious with using this 50-year-old crusty dairy tank. But
well, let's flip back. What you know, from some of your testing, now you're brewing, you've got some with these, you know, flaked and gelatinized, you know, ingredients, but then you brew without them. What kind of difference were you seeing in your beer in terms of flavors that started to develop over time? What kind of time frame would that happen in? And, you know, how would you describe the kind of threshold difference? You know, you mentioned it's not like oxidized.
Yeah, it's more like a muddled, it's more of a muddled note. And granted, you know, there are so many different variables. I mean, we're never doing the same type of like hop bill. And so it's kind of things dropping off faster. And dropping off, I know, is another general term, but yeah, I think most brewers are familiar enough with their own beer where you're like, why did that drop off quicker than, you know, other beers that are similar? But mostly it's kind of more of this, like this, just a slightly more muddled note. And again, that could have been, you know, we are looking back at what hot side hops did we use? You know, I think, you know, thinking of hop varieties, and I know we do when we are building recipes, some hops are, you know, softer and get kind of flabbier quicker as the beer ages, whereas some hops are more resilient and sharper and brighter and, you know, almost become amplified over the aging process. And so those beers that we kind of noticed that kind of seemed to get a little bit more muddled, maybe a touch flabbier. This was still a timeline of like, we're looking at beers that are 2 months old. So like we'd never have been drinking these beers unless we, you know, saved them. So
that's an age where they would have been out of your customer's fridge probably for a month already by that point.
Yeah. And I mean, we're looking, you know,
although you never know, because I mean, I've seen consumers these days with 9 and 12 month old hazy IPAs, and, you know, there's always that one person.
People are still checking in our fresh hop beers from last harvest on Untapped. There's one guy, I see that guy
Yeah.
And I said, why are you holding on to that? At least they're not rating it,
Right.
which is sweet, kind of them.
Sure.
But yes, yeah. So these are beers that, most people, and I don't think most people really notice anyways. We kind of just notice just by comparing. Let's compare, 2-month-old beers to each other and see what's kind of going on. And,
Right.
I think it's just important to kind of to do. We're putting beer out in the market, and our market is still very small, and we still care about what our beer would taste like had it been in, the back of your fridge for 2 months.
Sure. Let's, since you brought up the subject of hops, we haven't talked about that really yet. And I'd love to kind of dive deeper into the way that you use and blend hops. Before we do that, the founders launched SS Brewtech with a very clear goal to advance brewing equipment design, performance, and quality to the very highest standards in the industry. With a team that draws upon strong functional backgrounds in brewing science, mechanical engineering, industrial design, supply chain, and manufacturing, SS Brewtech has the people and skill sets you want and expect from your supplier of pro brewing equipment. Head on over to ssbrewtech.com for more information on their brew houses and brewing gear. Also, food-grade lubricants are not your top concern. Your beer is. Lucky for you, Clarion has a passion for protecting your beer by helping to make your brewing system 100% food safe. When you switch to Clarion food-grade lubricants, you are reducing the risk of costly contamination and recalls to virtually zero, all while extending the life of your equipment. And that leaves you with the peace of mind to think about what really matters. Go to clarionlubricants.com to learn more. So, Steve, talk to me about building hop blends. Talk to me about the way that you think about hops, and how you've built a understanding of hops that feeds into some of the strategies that you use to design new beers.
Wow. Sure. Yes.
That's just a big question.
That's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to kind of tell people that as far as we divide hops up into IPA hops or hop forward beer hops, if that makes any sense. And then kind of hops that you'd never really use in an IPA, or, an American kind of version of things. And of those kind of hop forward beer hops, should we?
Hop forward beer hops. Okay.
Is there an acronym we can create for that? FHBH.
Yeah. HFBH. You should put that on a label, I guess. Yeah.
People will totally get that.
Oh, wait. Other half already did. Oh.
Right. Well, yes.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
in your mind, you've got them in these different buckets.
We've got these IPA hops. Let's just call them IPA hops.
Okay.
Because a pale ale is a small IPA and a double IPA is a bigger IPA. So
are there any beers other than IPAs? I mean, really just call them all IPA if you want them to sell, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, why not?
Sure.
I do wish the black IPA came back a little bit.
Oh, don't we all?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's some, and I've had some really good ones lately. It was so good to get Wookie Jack back for a little bit there, right?
That batch, Sam Tierney was kind enough to send us 4 cans of that, and it was phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these IPA hops, I used to kind of divide them into like 4 quadrants per se. So you've got citrusy components, tropical fruit components, and then you kind of have more of like an earthy, like woody component, and then more of this like floral component. And so when we were designing IPAs, we're kind of thinking about what's the original profile what's the vision of this beer, and then what hop combination can we use to push and pull other varieties. So a lot of times we kind of build a beer around, a dominant IPA hop. And I think there's really only like 5 or 6 hops that you can really like build, that can really, as a single hop, make an IPA.
Yeah. What are those hops for you? The hops that just make an IPA?
The hops that make an IPA. I mean, Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe, Strata, and then
Strata, a newcomer to your list.
Strata is phenomenal.
Yeah.
I'm so stoked on Strata. And then I think for a fifth one, I would add like Nelson Sauvin, or you could add Galaxy, but now we're kind of getting into these hops that a bad lot of one of those hops is not going to like be a great IPA, single hop great IPA.
Right.
But I guess you could kind of say that about any variety. So those are kind of like what
but the risk factor kind of ramps up when you start talking about something like Galaxy.
So yes, totally. And I mean, did you see the comments from like last month at all about like kind of the criticism of Galaxy via Hop Products Australia?
So we had a conversation with Connor and Tim of Cellar Maker last summer on the podcast, and they were very vocal about their opinions on Galaxy. And Tim was telling me that after that podcast aired, that they had a conversation with Hops. They were on a Zoom with Hops Products Australia, trying to push and lobby for and build some, figure out how they can, bridge that gap, and that nothing really came of it. That they were still going to blend lots and not allow for that kind of selection and granularity. And so, it is what it is. But at the same time, there are also brewers who are not as willing to take some of those risks anymore on that product.
Yes. Yeah. That's basically it in a nutshell. And I'm trying. My hope is that Connor remembers that we're tagging on to his Galaxy contracts for this coming year. I need to remind him that he had a couple boxes stashed away for us, because he will say, I mean, those guys are also so passionate about hops.
Right.
And I think none of us are afraid to send hops back anymore.
Right.
And say this isn't up to snuff. And it certainly takes a lot of trust and a back and forth relationship to be comfortable enough to be able to do something like that with a broker or with a farm. So anyways, those are kind of the hops, I guess, back on the building of an IPA recipe, where most of our IPAs are going to have at least one of those varieties in there. And I think a lot of IPAs kind of do, and then kind of think about how those hops play well with other hops, versus some hops that clash. A lot of it's trial and error, and a lot of it's kind of more of just this like sixth sense of some things that should work and some things that shouldn't work. And it still kind of all comes back to like that vision, that at least like the focus of like what you want out of the IPA before you're brewing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can show you. I then kind of went from that like kind of this like quadrant scenario, and I ended up creating kind of like a Venn diagram of those components, and because hops are complex, right? So they all have lots of different. I
see what you did there, but yes.
They all have lots of attributes, and so
right.
Kind of a more overlapping like Venn diagram I had made for this like IPA presentation in Brazil like a few years back that I was flown down there for, and so that at least kind of made a little bit more sense as far as like, well, you can really then nerd out and say, well, early harvest this versus late harvest this, and now they're even in different
right.
bubbles and things like that. So it's like there's always another like layer to each variety, and just becoming more and more familiar with that variety, with how it's processed, what farm it came from, when it was harvested, like during that window.
Mm-hmm.
All those things kind of factor in our decision to when to use hops, in a recipe. So, I mean, we have like 5 or 6 lots of Citra in the cooler. We contract 2 separate lots, and then we tend to kind of like keep lots from different harvests specifically for certain places to be added during the brewing process.
So that's interesting. You'll have a character from a prior year that's just kind of unique. You'll keep holding on to just that, part of the lot so that it could add something in a future year just because. Totally,
because you never know what you're going to get next harvest. And so, and we are at the point where we do select our own hops, and that certainly helps. But even when you're rubbing, selection itself is kind of this inherently flawed process where you're rubbing, a handful of hops that came out of a 200-pound bale. And so this little piece
Right.
is supposed to represent a large chunk of this thing. And that, that acre had 10 bales of this thing, but you're only rubbing a handful out of one of the 10 bales. And then that is all going to get blended from that whole farm, which could have been harvesting 8 acres of Citra that day. So there's no way to fully know and predict what you're getting, even if you're selecting your hops.
Sure.
Every harvest. So just having a known variable is just a way to kind of hedge against that.
I mean, you're talking about individual plants next to each other, similar. I mean, they're the same genetically, but they who knows what's happening in that living thing and how those can be different. But over time, it's you average and create this aggregate, and it does average out any of those smaller little pieces in there. But you're right. It's a interesting process. You probably drive yourself crazy trying to get too precise about it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can, I mean, there are some there, I guess, I think there's a little bit of crazy in every brewer, especially, the ones that are kind of coming up with the ideas. And so, it's all about knowing your limits of like how much you can perseverate over a certain thing.
Right.
As far as hop selection goes, really what we want is just, we're confident we can make a great IPA with just above average, hop quality. And I think that's every brewer's like dream, is just to have not a dud lot. And I think, as far as like advocating for hop contracts, like that's kind of how you avoid that. Not to be like a hop contract pusher, but I mean, we only do about 2,000 barrels of beer a year, and we have contracts with 5 or 6 different, brokers or farms every year.
Yeah.
And we're contracting like 95% of our projected usage of these hops, just so that we have some say over the hops that we're using versus what's available on a spot market type of thing. And so we're just prioritizing, in a year like a pandemic where you're going to be long on hops, well, at least the hops in our cooler are the hops that we picked and are happy to use eventually, kind of a thing, versus I'd rather have those in my cooler and be short tens of thousands of dollars versus have this money and then buy some hops that are I'm not going to be happy with.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get back to that mental process. You have your quadrants, and your kind of layered Venn diagram, because each of these hops, even when they're picked or what that selection might be for that, might be a little bit different. What's that next step in kind of idealizing and kind of mentally figuring how these things are going to work together?
I mean, so once we kind of have our combination and thought of like, what we want this IPA to exhibit. We build, the hopping regimen. So we have always added hops to the boil kettle, multiple additions, whether it's pales, IPAs, double IPAs, whether it's
old school style,
old school,
man.
Yeah. Multiple
hot side additions. That's not cool anymore, Steve.
I know. But it's so apparent. I think you guys know too, like the more IPAs that you're drinking, especially like the hazy ones, the more so they lack depth. They kind of just drop off. You're drinking it, you're smelling it. They're meant to be this like high aroma impact, but as soon as you swallow it, there's nothing really left. It's hollow is kind of how I think about it. And I think without adding hops to the boil kettle, you're gonna kind of have your less depth and kind of this more hollow, like mid palate and finish.
It's interesting that you're talking about it, not just in terms of the bitterness that it's adding, but also, some sort of kind of consistency and fullness and everything else to the beer itself.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, like when we want our IPAs to taste as good or if not better on your last sip of a full pint than your first one. And it's always been my assumption where the first sip is the one that's like, oh, wow, like this is fantastic. And then, with a lot of beers, by the time you're done drinking it, you're like, all right, I'm kind of over this beer. Whereas we'd rather have someone open it up and say, okay, all right, let me have another sip and figure it out. And by the end of it, you're like, wow, that was really great. I'd like to have another one or try another like beer of theirs, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm a firm believer that one is basically more kettle hops. You know, it doesn't have to be, we add hops at boil, but we add hops typically like in our IPAs anywhere from 15 to 10 minutes left in the boil. And there's usually anywhere from 5 to 2 minutes left in the boil too. And it doesn't have to be a lot of hops to go a long way. One of the fun things about doing collabs with friends and other breweries is you kind of get a peek under the hood about how they design beers too. And we did a double IPA that was packaged at the beginning of the pandemic with Great Notion, who makes fantastic hazy beers, award-winning hazy beers. And they were doing this double IPA, kind of an imperial version of a beer that we brewed here 4 or 5 years ago. And I really wanted to add hops to the kettle because I don't think they've ever added hops to the kettle. And, you know, they did. And they added, you know, I think we did on a 15 barrel system, they ended up doing an 11-pound bag of Citra hops with 5 minutes left in the boil. And they were kind of nervous that it was going to make this beer too bitter for their drinkers' palates. But when I, you know, got our case, I thought it was fantastic because it didn't just, there was enough hop flavor that sat on your tongue afterwards that wanted you to take another sip.
Yeah. And especially with some of these sweeter, you know, hazier IPAs, that bitterness, especially if it's this nice, smooth bitterness that tucks into it and, you know, without that kind of old school ragged, you know, and rough bitterness, you know, if it's well-placed bitterness that has these other, you know, especially using something like Citra that brings other elements that help kind of smooth and massage that bitterness, then it can be a really pleasant thing in that kind of context. I mean, I don't know that people are that afraid of I mean, I should say I tend to keep craving more bitterness in most of these IPAs.
Totally.
You know, and that is less of a disqualifier than something that is thin and sweet.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where I think talking to a lot of brewers these days, we're all kind of looking for more bitterness. And I think that kind of leads into this, you know, West Coast IPA was never really gone, but it seems like more and more people are starting to come back around to it.
And I'm hearing it anecdotally, you know, from brewers that people are asking for the clear IPAs again. You know, even consumers that may have been ordering that hazy IPA, like, you know, it's happening. And part of that, I think, is, you know, brewers are making lighter, you know, all pale malt West Coast IPAs that all allow that hops expression out there. They're using the same hops and they're, you know, kind of pushing some of those same fruit characters. So it's not unfamiliar to people. And some of these West Coast IPAs now are better than West Coast IPA has ever been. It's really fun. Talk to me a little bit about how because you play in both of those realms. You make the hazy beers and you also make clear West Coast IPAs. You know, talk to me about the interplay between those two and how brewing one might inform the way you think about, you know, building a recipe for the other.
I mean, we kind of, we blend a lot of times our lines are blurred here for sure. And
then we had the same conversation with Connor and Tim because they brew hazy West Coast IPAs that are very dry, but also, you know, have that kind of awesome fruity contemporary hop character. And it's just fun to watch people, you know, watch you all playing in these kinds of in-between spaces.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like when we want to push more West Coast, I mean, it's kind of easy on the dial as far as to kind of ramp up a little bit more earlier additions on our boil kettle, and then we're adding clarifiers. You know, we do Royal Flock, BWS in the kettle. We'll use some Biofine, you know, during conditioning, and that's really like the only difference that we're doing at this point, since our yeast is the same.
Yeah, our
terminal is the same. So as far as like perception, you know. Water treatment does change. If we want something to be kind of perceived more of a hazy, we'll certainly kind of ramp up the calcium chloride. But every beer, whether it's lilts more West Coast or more hazy, we're still adding. We basically add gypsum to the mash. We add calcium chloride to the kettle. at boil, and that's kind of the only water treatment as far as salts go. And then pH adjustments during sparge with phos acid, and then with lactic acid in the whirlpool to kind of just get our wort pH where we want it to be. And, to kind of depending on if it's hazier or if it's more West Coast, we're going to tweak our salts and our acid like any kind of chef would to kind of make the final dish kind of hit all the marks, kind of a thing. And that's a newer thing too. I mean, between Tim at Cellar Maker, Joe Pinehouse, Evan at Green Cheek, Bob at Highland Park, they're more water nerds out there because they don't have great water in LA. We have great water here.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever added any salts to like an Elysian beer recipe other than like, a dry Irish stout. Of course, we're going to like throw some gypsum in there and try to, do that more traditional. Like let's mirror the water source of this traditional style.
Right.
But now really kind of like playing with salts and acids to get your wort to exactly where you want it to be, so you don't have to really worry about the rest. As long as your fermentation is clean, it kind of does the rest for you.
Sure. So yeah, we've talked about hops and this kind of interplay. Are there any interesting elements? You mentioned obviously tank geometry is one piece of the fermentation puzzle, and I guess we talked about your corporate yeast. Do you especially with with these hazy beers versus the West Coast beers, are there any fermentation concerns in those that are especially unique or tweaks that you found to help improve those or make those ultimately finish the way you want them to finish?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think people tend, when they see hazy, they do lean towards more sweet. So fermentation wise, if we're gonna mash a little bit hotter, but nothing too out of the ordinary. I think a beer that we would want to be drier. I mean, our yeast is so dry, but our mash range is usually between 151 for things that we really want drier and a greater perceived bitterness, to just something that's like 154, 155 for I mean, that our yeast will still get down to like high twos, for mashing at like 154, 155. Yeah. So, I mean, fermentation wise, with our like kind of cooler, slower primary fermentation, it's usually around 13 to 14 days for primary. Really what we've kind of started to do is play around with the timing of our dry hop. I mean, another old school, I guess I can, even though we're a young brewery and I'm a relatively young brewer, I still consider myself a little bit more old school as far as our processes go.
Right.
We're kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. We're basically starting to tweak and change our dry hop regimen. Right. So the timing of our dry hop. So previously, primary fermentation around 13 days is when when our beer is sensory VDK negative. Then we drop the temperature a tiny bit. Yeast is all off of our unit tank, and then we're dry hopping at ambient for about a week. Crash, carb, package. But as hop loads increase, that like us kind of waiting for the beer initially to be VDK negative, then adding a larger dry hop charge, you see that secondary spike, that VDK creep. And so that's basically tacking on another 13 days before, that dry hop is mopped, for us to then crash and package. So now we're kind of, it's always that yeast play game where like once that yeast is cropped, do we dry hop on day 7? Well, we still know it's we don't even really even know where it is in the VDK curve at day 7. We're assuming it's probably still ramping up to kind of get ahead of the dry hop creep, and that's kind of where we're leaning towards more. But yeah, that old school, like more traditional way of dry hopping was like primary fermentation's done. Now we dry hop. Considering then when we need yeast, do we need yeast next week, this week, kind of a thing, and dry hopping earlier and earlier when you would assume you've got more healthy yeast in suspensions, a little bit more active, less dormant, to then expedite and mop up that VDK, quicker. We don't have a lab, we don't have a microscope.
Right. You don't have a microscope.
Don't even have a microscope.
Oh, man.
So for as much of some things that we really kind of like nerd out and dive into as far as the science component.
Anton Par C box, but you don't have a microscope.
Yeah, the Anton Par C box was the first lab equipment that we bought.
Okay.
I guess a pH meter, we had that.
Yeah.
But like cropping and pitching yeast, we do by volume. Site, taste, volume. We're either pitching 15 gallons or pitching 25 gallons, depending on the size of the batch. And again, that kind of comes back. That is kind of one of those benefits of just knowing your yeast. If it's the yeast that I've been using for 10, 12 years now, you kind of are a little bit more in tune for that.
Sure.
But yes, that does kind of freak people out that we don't have a microscope. So I don't know what our cell counts are.
Yeah. But you can test the viability just by taste.
I mean, it's keeping it simple. Like we're looking at that yeast before we crop. We're basically, getting the dead stuff off, looking at it. Does it look healthy? What's the consistency of it? What's it smell like? What's it taste like? Good to go. I mean, I think if you have everything else, in a row, it should be kind of like clockwork and fairly predictable. And so,
sure.
That's the vibe that we're in right now.
Yeah. Well, let's, as we finish up here, let's zoom out a little bit. What's the immediate future look like for Cloudburst? Last year, you opened up a tap room in another neighborhood here in Seattle in the middle of a pandemic, which, what a great business move to open a second location in the middle of a pandemic. What are the next steps for Cloudburst? Where do you see this going? And then what's that bigger picture? Where do you want to be? What's the measure of success for you and for Cloudburst?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes. I mean, at this point we kind of talked about this a little bit before, but kind of prioritizing, why I started a brewery was because my passion is brewing, creating beers, making the beers. And that's something that I don't ever want to push myself out of. So as far as like production growth goes, there's only so big we can be. And we're kind of in this happy spot of about 2,000 barrels of beer a year. And we don't really see much, more volume growth from that. Part of opening that second location, which was, obviously in the works before the pandemic, was how do we continue to like be a healthy business when you're not growing anymore as far as production goes. And of course the answer to that is, the more beer we can sell over our own bar
at the highest possible margin. Sure.
Yeah. And so, kind of going from there, I mean, that second location, we have a couple tanks over there that we have toted wort over for some stainless lagers that we're co-fermenting with Brett. So kind of like Brett Pilsners, because we haven't played around, both Zach and myself haven't played around with any wild yeast or bugs in this building because the exposed 120-year-old timber is 6 inches from some dry hop ports, so we didn't want to bring fire into this space. So I mean, I guess as far as like where we see ourselves going, I mean, it's kind of nice being like a brewer run brewery. Like it's not like we're chasing this growth or anything. I'll always consider myself a brewer first, and like a business owner is my secondary role that I have to do so that I can still be the brewer that I want to be. Right. And I'm sure, if we weren't in a great financial situation, then those priorities would have to change, or this place wouldn't exist. But we are doing okay to have a lot of happy employees that have been here since the beginning in the early days. And kind of working towards some type of work-life balance. Maybe not so much me, but I try to make sure that everybody else does have that, kind of give people the jobs that you wish you had. And so the next step is then kind of for me to be able to, it's really hard to turn off work, I think, for any small business owner, especially in the brewing industry where so much of the brewers and the owners are connected to that business that it's hard to like make a separation. I'm certainly not there at all yet, and I don't know if I ever will be. I don't think that's the type of person I can be to like just not like leave and not think about it. Even on vacation, you're thinking about what's going on like at your place. So I think for a 5-year goal, it's like maybe we can chill out and like not have to perseverate over everything that's going on. And a lot of that is just having the right people in place and keeping them happy. So
but I love that, one of the things you said earlier before we started the podcast was that you want to stay on that brew deck. Totally. You don't want to get so big that you're not there on the brew deck.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. I mean, every single Cloudburst beer made has just been myself and Zach. It's two people that are making the beer all the time. And we've, have people come and go that can certainly affect the end product of the beer. But the most important thing is for me to be making beer on that brew deck.
Well, it's fantastic beer, and it's been fun to talk to you about how you make it.
Thanks.
G&D Chillers is the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling. Crisp Scottish pale ale malt is the workhorse of many a brewery. Try craft juice concentrates from Old Orchard. Set up your account on marketmybrewery.com today. Let SS Brewtech outfit your brew house and gain peace of mind with Clarion lubricants. Of course, if you'd like to support this very podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button. And if you're a pro brewer, consider our all-access pro subscriptions that combine the magazines with exclusive online content and more. And, of course, if you're a subscriber, you can go in and check out that back issue. I think it was 2017 issue with a breakout brewer on Steve and Cloudburst. And I do think there's a homebrew scale recipe in there along with it. And so, hey, it's a good reason to be a subscriber. Steve, if people want to learn more about Cloudburst, find the beers that you make, etc., where do they find you on the internet and in real life?
Oh, man, on the internet, our website is cloudburstbrew.com. And we're pretty much, at this rate, only active on Instagram. We have Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts. And, Instagram is kind of more aligned with what we're doing. As far as beer goes, I mean, you got to come to Seattle. That's kind of it.
Yeah.
We have one small account in Portland, Oregon, a handful of accounts outside of Seattle city limits, but 97% of our beer is Seattle city limits. So come to Seattle.
There you go.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful city.
Great
beautiful
scene.
State.
Yeah.
Lots to do and see. Well, thanks for talking with me on the podcast today, Steve. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.